Hello, welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos on a weekly basis for a twofold purpose. First off, to help as a tool for myself as I take my brain out of percolation mode and move it into sermonation mode, or namely stop thinking about the sermon and actually start preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation on this coming Sunday. And the second reason for making these videos is for you, the viewer, who have stumbled across this video for whatever reason has brought you to this digital doorstep, to begin to gain just a little different insight or more opinions or more ideas or whatever on the assigned gospel lesson as laid out by the Revised Common Lectionary, a organizational tool on a 3-year cycle that sets up scripture lessons for worship purposes. This particular Sunday, which is April 19th, 2015, the third Sunday of Easter, our gospel lesson comes from Luke chapter 24, verses 36b through 48. Now, interestingly enough, here in year B of the lectionary, or normally the year of Mark, these post-Easter stories are coming from multiple Gospels. Easter Sunday, which was a couple weeks back, was out of Mark's Gospel, as we would expect. Then last week, as every year, the next Sunday after Easter is always the story of the disciples in the upper room and doubting Thomas, that appearance of Jesus over the course of a week 2 times to the disciples. And now this one is Luke's account of actually a very similar story to what we heard last week, if you happen to catch that video. Again, last week was John's gospel. This week it comes out of Luke. And some of that is because Mark just ends so abruptly. If you happen to catch the Easter one video from a couple weeks ago, I talked about that Mark's gospel just ends basically at the tomb, that the women find the empty tomb, the angels tell them Jesus has gone on ahead of you, he is not here, and they run away and they're frightened and they don't tell anybody, and that's the end of Mark's gospel. So when we try and get these post-resurrection appearances, we have to go to the other 3 gospels besides just Mark. So that's kind of where these different jumping into the different gospel accounts is coming from. Just a tiny little bit of background, but again, this story will sound very, very similar to the account that we heard from John last week, and a reasoning for that, scholars believe that John, which was the last of the 4 Gospels to be written, was very likely had Luke as a reference, Luke's Gospel, and that's why we see such a similarity between the two. So if you're interested in that, go back and check out last week's Sermon Braindump video. I can link that down in the comments too, so you can find that if you're interested in seeing it. Otherwise, just search through my page, and it's just the previous one. So, but anyway, coming back around, Luke 24 verses 36b through 48. I guess one more little tiny bit of reference directly preceding this passage, between the resurrection account period, and then the beginning of this, we have the road to Emmaus, which is another fairly well-known story, to where 2 random disciples, one of which is named Clopas, and we don't know who the other one is, are walking to Emmaus, and it's Sunday. Emmaus is a village that's about 7 miles away from Jerusalem, and that's farther than they could walk on the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath, which would have been Saturday, so they had to wait until Sunday to go. So they're walking along, and suddenly Jesus appears and is with them, but they don't know it's him. But they talk about things, and he opens he opens their minds to the scriptures, and then they share a meal, and in the breaking of the bread, they realize, oh, hey, this is Jesus. And those 2 people, Clopas and the other person, they run back to Jerusalem, and they find the disciples who are in the upper room, and that's where we are now. So Jesus himself stood among them, or among the disciples, and said to them, "Peace be with you." Again, we heard that last week a lot more, though. We only hear it the one time here in Luke. They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and feet, see that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Okay, so Jesus shows up. We don't hear that they're locked away, as John tells us. So there's no like odd ability to go through walls or to pass through walls. So we don't get that here. But we hear that as the disciples and the random two other disciples are talking about what's happened and who has seen Jesus and who hasn't, and we have seen the Lord. Suddenly Jesus is there standing among them. And the first thing, once again, like last week, the first thing we hear is peace be with you, or peace to you. And Jesus is offering that, be at peace. And perhaps it's because he knows that their response is they think they see a ghost. Jesus had been dead. There can be no doubt of that. And even with the things that the disciples have seen, the fact that they have seen Jesus raise people from the dead previously, we have 3 different examples of that in the Gospels. It stands to reason that even though he could raise other people from death, now he's dead, and that's it. If the healer, if the miracle worker is dead, then there can be no more miracles. So if there's one thing that should be certain for the disciples, for the followers of Christ in this time, it's that, hey, he's dead. As they say, there's 2 things certain in life: death and taxes. And but apparently now God's doing something about that, and maybe now death is not quite so permanent. But coming full circle, I kind of went on a little tangent there. So he shows up, and they think he's a ghost. They're like, okay, are you were dead? So is this just the spirit that's hanging around because you haven't gone on yet to wherever it is that dead people go? Whatever the thought process is, and it's not that they were naive back then and we know better now. There's still people who talk about the spirits now, and we don't know what that is. But so anyway, long story short, they think he's a ghost, but he reassures them, "I am not a ghost. Why are you scared? Look, it's me. Look at my hands, look at my feet. You can see the holes of the nails. Touch me. See that I am flesh and bone. I am not a spirit. I am here. I am alive. I am talking to you." While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Okay, so this is just considered to probably be further evidence of hey, I am alive again. I am human. Give me some food and I'll eat it. And he does. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. But what I'm interested in within that particular little portion is the whole, while in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering. This apparently is an experience that's absolutely wonderful. Jesus had been dead, but now he's not dead anymore, and that's great. That's beyond great. That's just absolutely wonderful. But it's so wonderful they have trouble believing it. And this is an interesting take on what we seem to have heard perhaps last week with Doubting Thomas of this is too good to be true. I just can't wrap my head around it. And it makes me think of moments in our lives when something so spectacular happens that we just can't believe that this is really happening. And that's perhaps something that I'll talk about within the sermon, that think about those times in our lives when something so remarkable occurs that, yes, we're happy, but at the same token, we're just like, I can't believe this is real. So that's going on. Another interesting thing about this notion of Jesus eating with them or eating in front of them, it puts to mind the notion of communion, and this will be a communion Sunday here in my congregation, so that's interesting. And good things happen around food. They just do. And maybe that's a Lutheran perspective. We eat a lot. We like our potlucks, but good things happen around food. Fellowship happens around food. Relationship happens around food. And and think about all the different times when Jesus has eaten with the wrong people. We oftentimes hear that he's accused of eating with sinners. He fraternizes, probably isn't the right word, but he takes time to be with sinful people, with tax collectors, with prostitutes. We hear of that he goes and visits Zacchaeus at his house, and Jesus is always seeming to be with the wrong people. Even the disciples themselves were probably considered to be the wrong people. And yet those are the ones that Jesus chooses to be with. And if we think about communion and the fact that Jesus promises us that when we take bread and break it and we have wine, that he is there, that he is there with us, that it is his body, it is blood, he is present there with us. So what's that say? That we're the wrong people when we gather around that table? Maybe so, because we're not worthy of it. We're not worthy of the grace of God. Nothing that we do earns it, and yet God claims us as his children, and God claims out of love for us that we are worthwhile despite our sinfulness, despite our inabilities, despite our flaws. So I heard once a statement that I really kind of liked, that we know it's communion, it's truly communion when the wrong people are around the table. And this kind of speaks to that, and that's somewhere I might go with the sermon as well, of talking about that Jesus, well known for eating with the wrong people, for spending time with the wrong people, promises that in that meal he's with us, despite our flaws. So I kind of like that, but I'm going to move on now. After he had eaten the fish, then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning with Jerusalem. You are witnesses to these things." Okay, so that's the end of the gospel. Some different things going on here that I really like. There's a little theme here in the post-resurrection within Luke, and actually Luke's gospel ends just a couple of verses after this. There's about 3 or 4 more verses, and then that's the end. But there's this theme of Jesus opening things. The 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, their eyes were kept from recognizing him, but then in the breaking of the bread, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Also, with those 2 guys on the road to Emmaus, Jesus opened the scriptures for them. And then we hear now with the disciples in the upper room, he opened the scriptures for the disciples. Now, this Greek word is dianoigo, at least that's the root word. If you know anything about Greek, you know that different tenses or different forms change it. But the root word is dianoigo, and it means to open completely. Now, on the road to Emmaus, it's in the passive form, that their eyes were opened and that their minds were open to the scriptures. And because it's not the work of those 2 disciples that does so, they are passive in it. It's opened by something else. Well, by what? Well, it's opened by Jesus, and it's opened by in the breaking of the bread, their eyes. And now here with the disciples, it's in the active form, and Jesus is opening the scriptures to them to understand how the scriptures pertain to him. Now, is Jesus proof texting the Old Testament for them? No, probably not. One of my old professors on a podcast that I listen to on the gospel lesson every week in preparation has said, did Jesus pick out a random piece of passage from the book of Job and say, haha, see, it's about me? No, that's probably not what's going on. But in a conversation with some other pastors this week, we talked about how there's so many different aspects of the Old Testament that when we view through the lens of the resurrection, of the crucifixion and resurrection, takes on so much new meaning that we can only see post-resurrection. And this is an interesting notion to think about, that what did the resurrection change? Well, the resurrection changed a lot of things, but it's one of those things of we could not truly understand how the Old Testament pertains to our life as Christians today, the work that God is doing through Jesus, until the resurrection had happened. And only the resurrected Christ can open our understanding, to give us that understanding, if that makes sense. And so that's yet another point that I might go with. There's a lot of different directions I can go with the sermon, and I'll be honest, I don't know which one I'm going with yet. But it is just really kind of fascinating to think about that. And perhaps that's the nature of how God works in the world. That God works the unexpected thing, and we can never anticipate what God's going to do until after it happens. Well, I guess you're not anticipating it. Sorry, we can't anticipate what God is going to do, but once it's happened, then we're kind of like, oh yeah, that kind of does seem like that would be the nature of God to do that. And we see that in the resurrection. And as I said before, the disciples were in such disbelief because Jesus was dead, and dead people stay dead. And yet Jesus is alive again, and that changes everything. And yet we see that, well, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him may not perish but have eternal life. The nature of God is one of love and one of life. And so it makes sense that God would do something about death, that God would do, that through taking on flesh and dying himself, God beat it. And do we understand it perfectly? No, of course we don't. Is there still more that we will learn as we go through our lives? Yeah, probably. And is there more that we will understand in the life to come? Yeah, probably, when we join in the resurrection. But the great news about all this, and what we need to remember here, especially in the season of Easter, is the resurrection's not one day. We live in the reality that there is resurrection right now. And the disciples were the first witnesses to this. That's what I really love how this passage ends. You are witnesses to this. You have seen this has happened. And what do witnesses do? Well, they go and they tell. And likewise, we too are witnesses. We go and we tell what we have experienced, what we have come to know, what God has opened our minds to. So that's what's going on with this passage. Probably the directions that I might go with the sermon. I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any thoughts or questions or comments, by all means, please pop those down into the comment section. I always love to hear from you when those show up. And you and I can continue this conversation in and around this passage, and that will be wonderful. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll catch you next time.